Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Mia Colson. I'm the Grants Manager at the National Association of Regional Councils. If you have any technical questions during the webinar, feel free to email me directly at mia@narc.org or send it through the question box. I am pleased to welcome today's presenter. Peter Harnik is the Director of the Trust for Public Lands Center for City Park Excellence and a keeper of the nation's most complete set of data about the park systems in the bigger cities. He writes prolifically, and his most recent book is Urban Green, Innovative Parks for Resurgent Cities, which we highly recommend. His latest booklet was just published and is about the triumphs and pitfalls of city park conservancies. And Peter is based in Washington, D.C. So there will be time for questions and discussion at the end of the presentation. If you have questions during the presentation, please feel free to send them in the chat box. We will also be unmuting people at the end of the presentation if you wish to ask your question verbally. The last bit is the PDF of the presentation will be made available following the webinar. And with that, I will turn it over to Mr. Harnik.
Thanks so much, Mia. Thanks for inviting me. I'm thrilled to be here today with all of you. This is the first time I've ever done this particular show, this particular presentation. So I'll just tell you that we do have some slides with it. There's going to be some places where we don't have slides. We're going to have a black screen, and I'll be talking. But don't use that time to multitask, because actually the most interesting information will probably be during the black screens, and also you won't know when we're coming back to pictures. So the Trust for Public Land, many of you may have heard of us, is a national organization, national conservation organization working to create parks and save land for people. And the center, the division that I run, Center for City Park Excellence, is kind of a research and development and analysis operation within the Trust for Public Land that's studying city parks. What makes for great city parks, what makes for weak city parks, how parks can make cities better and regions better. And a few years ago, we got a contract from the Association of Bay Area Governments in the San Francisco Bay Area that is a very interesting challenge. It was so interesting that I asked Mia whether we could present to all of you about some of our findings on this. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the San Francisco Bay Area, but I know most of you on the call are not from there, and I'm going to try and universalize the conversation as much as possible, because I don't want to get into the weeds on the technicalities of what's going on in San Francisco Bay Area, but try and get some lessons for other regions, metropolitan regions around the country. And we'll try and hold this to about 20, 25 minutes and have time for a robust conversation if it stimulates any thinking on your part. So we're talking about the San Francisco Bay Area, which is a very large area, 9 counties, and many of you know it, but if you don't, San Francisco is the peninsula right in the middle on the left there, and the bay is the big body of water in between that big population area of about 6 or 7 million people. So the Association of Bay Area Governments has something called Planned Priority Development Areas. They also have something called priority conservation areas, and I'm not aware whether all of you have similar things yourselves, and I'd like to find out more about this. But basically, the Bay Area, which of course is one of the most environmentally oriented regions of the country, is trying to do a kind of a smart growth strategy of having areas that should be developed and areas that shouldn't be developed. And I'm actually interested in the areas that should be developed because I want to help them develop parks. There's many other people and institutions working to conserve land and conserve open space, but the park areas that we're talking about are pretty much all developed. So we're interested in these priority development areas. They vary tremendously. There's not kind of a standard area. There's one that's 12,000 acres, and there's one that's 21 acres. And there's one with a population of 152,000 and one with a population of 44. That's just 44. So there's a tremendous range in these priority development areas, but regardless of the variations, the median area devotes 1.1% of its land area to parks and open space, 1.1%, which is one reason that we're anxious to try and get more infill parks in these development areas so that it doesn't become, you know, a canyon, a Manhattan-type canyon of big buildings and no open space. So the current parks, and we're pretty liberal on the way we define parks, as is ABAG, plazas, transit plazas, small parks, community-scale parks, and then regional open spaces. So the main thing that this study did was to look at the future aspirations. What do these planned development areas want to have? And it turns out that they want to have 236, when they did this study, they wanted to have 236 more parks to help mitigate the impacts of increased development and to provide Bay Area residents with more opportunities for socialization and recreation. But the spread between the hopes and realities is like a chasm. These hopes are on plans that just sit there year after year, and the reality is not coming through in most cases. And because of the difficulty of finding land and finding funding for these parks and plaza spaces, or in some cases overcoming opposition, ABAG wanted us to help determine the specific needs and the obstacles that were being faced by these PDAs. Priority development areas. So when it comes to infrastructure needs, it turns out parks is pretty high on the list, much higher than many parks people think. They did an infrastructure needs by type, and parks came in third after affordable housing and transit station improvements. This wouldn't be the same for every one of your cities, but it might be pretty similar for many of them, that parks are that high on the list. They're even higher, surprisingly to anybody who drives around the Bay Area, they're even higher than the road and utility improvements that the planners were identifying. So then we asked them, what do they use to create parks and develop them? And in order, this is in order, they said developer fees, capital improvement programs, tax increment financing, and voter-improved levies and bonds. And then on a smaller scale, some communities pursued private grants, special taxing districts, and even voluntary developer contributions. But those are going to be much smaller. So what exactly is the problem here? That so many people want parks, and so many parks are needed, and so few parks are being created. So when it comes to creating and improving parks, land prices and labor costs in the Bay Area are very high, so parks become very expensive. And even though there's a very broad political advocacy, it's broad but not always that deep. Everybody loves parks. Everybody says they want a park, but when it comes to rolling up their sleeves and being advocates for parks, it doesn't always go deep enough. Very often there's stronger advocacy for natural conservation than for local parks. So because of this, park planners and managers are constantly scrambling to find alternative methods of financing the creation of parks. But I mean, you've got to be realistic. Alternative financing can only take you so far. You still actually ultimately need real money. You can't just keep talking about alternate financing. It does come down to needing the money. And the two most significant park challenges that we were told all the time when we interviewed people is lack of sufficient funds and inability to overcome opposition. sometimes you have to listen between the lines when people are talking. So they'll say things like, well, we have a shortage of available land, we have a shortage of funding, we have available land, but it's very expensive. But in fact, these are all the same things. Lack of sufficient funds. And actually, this phrase might even disguise the reality of political opposition, which is what's drying up the money. Land is always available if there's enough money to buy it. And conversely, some of you on the webinar today, I think we have somebody from Youngstown, for instance, might have very inexpensive land, but you still might not have enough money to buy it. So in a way, that's somewhat of a circular argument. Rich places have expensive land, but they have more money to work with, and poor places have cheap land and less money to work with, and you still have to work to close the loop. As for the opposition part of it, the most usual reason relates somehow to cars and parking, and we'll see a couple of examples of that later on. But in one form or another, cars and parking generally rises up as the main competitor to parks. I'm not going to go into the weeds on these PDAs. Like I said, I don't want to get bogged down in the San Francisco Bay Area. That'll be of tremendous interest to Bay Area folks, and I'd be happy to talk to them in greater detail offline. But I'll just say that in our study, we found 5 of the PDAs, the priority districts, that seem to have both political consensus and available funding. So these are kind of green lights, and maybe something can happen there. We found 18 that had political consensus in favor of parks, but not enough money to do it. And then we've found 20 that had flat-out opposition from residents or politicians. And by the way, when politicians and sometimes even park directors themselves are opposed to parks, they don't say they're opposed to parks. They say, well, it's better to have no park at all than to have a poorly maintained park that brings down the neighborhood. So that's the way it gets expressed. And many park directors have learned bitter lessons that they got a park that they can't maintain. So instead of focusing on San Francisco, I want to do 2 specific things on the call, and we're going to black out for a couple of minutes while I talk about that. First of all, I want to make a plea to every regional council in the country, to everybody here on the phone and all of your colleagues, to begin a process to look at your urban infill park needs and to begin figuring out a structure for solving them. Like I said, I'm not talking about greenfield parks, conservation lands on the fringe of your region. Those are tough, but not as tough as the ones that I'm talking about. I'm talking about redevelopment parks closer to the center of your regions or in the center of your towns in your regions. And if you already have such a process, I really want to hear about it, so be prepared to speak up at the end of this presentation and tell all of us on the phone about what you've got and how well it's working or not working. And then secondly, I want to tell 4 real-life stories that we've learned from our Bay Area studies, stories about the actual creation of infill parks despite all the difficulties. These are heartwarming stories, but keep in mind the context that these are practically the only infill parks that were created in the past decade, even though the Bay Area is especially environmentally oriented. So as you listen to the stories, think about the interplay between the planners and the advocates. So here we go. The 4 parks are called Doyle Hollis Park in Emeryville, Windsor Town Center in Windsor, Mission Bay Sports Center in San Francisco itself, and Frog Park in Oakland. So Emeryville is a tiny, tiny town squeezed between Oakland and Berkeley and the Bay Bridge. It has 10,000 residents and 20,000 daytime workers, and it's only 1.2 square miles, the whole city. For most of the 20th century, it was an industrial center, and now it's a very cool hub for biotech and software, very desirable. It has a tremendous dearth of parkland, as you can see. I think those green lines are probably bike lanes. So the actual parks are very few and far between. And it has a huge demand for parking because of all of the commuters. So in 1999, when the city's planning department began to develop a plan for the North Hollis area, it focused on a warehouse site to build a parking structure, and they began relocating tenants and arranging acquisition. But the citizens started opposing a 6-story, 700-vehicle parking structure right in the middle of their low-rise neighborhood and right across from a middle school without playing fields. So the city responded, maybe we can put the garage under a park, but the site was too narrow, and the entrance lanes to the underground garage would have taken up about half the site. The neighbors had already coalesced one time before to redesign that Emeryville Greenway that you can see there as a park rather than as an as a parkway rather than as an auto-oriented street. So they had some awareness of each other, some social cohesion, neighborhood social cohesion, and they arose again, lobbying council members and the school board, and ultimately they got the block rezoned to open space. From then on, things moved relatively quickly. I'll show you how it came out at the end. And this is so beautiful, it brings tears to the eyes, which is why the slide is so out of focus. In 2005, the site was bought by the Emeryville Redevelopment Agency for $5 million using capital improvement funds. I'm going to run through a little bit of the dollars here because I know many of you are budget oriented. The same year, the Economic Development Coordinator got $75,000 from a EPA Brownfield Assessment Grant. And then later on they got a $200,000 Brownfield Cleanup Grant for remediation, and a $500,000 loan from the EPA Brownfield Revolving Fund, which was matched by $100,000 from the Redevelopment Agency. So all told, including land purchase, the park cost $10 million, and day-to-day maintenance is handled by the Emeryville Department of Public Works for about $53,000 a year. So it opened up in 2009 after a year of actual construction. And it includes a children's play area, restrooms, a recreation lawn, basketball court, rain garden that takes 85% of the stormwater runoff on site, and a public art fountain designed by an artist. And park use has exceeded all expectations of planners and politicians. So that's one story. The next story is of Windsor. I can't make a pointer on this. Windsor is pretty far up on the northern edge of the metropolitan area. It's actually way up there, 65 miles north of San Francisco. But it's a real town, 27,000 people. It was a railroad hub. It used to be a wine processing town with a downtown. So we're not, we're still talking smart growth here. That there's a town that needs redevelopment, and the park, they wanted to use the park to do it. And this is a completely different story. This park grew out of a desire to reclaim a largely abandoned downtown and attract tourists, wine country tourists, to come to Windsor as opposed to other places in Sonoma County. Okay, so the vision of transforming the underutilized downtown into a public plaza first emerged in 1986, and planners hit upon using the grounds of a vacant junior high school campus, which was lucky. It was already publicly owned, which somewhat held off neighbor opposition that might otherwise have arisen. So it took a long time, of course, for things to move forward. But in 1999, after the exact location of the town green itself had been selected, the Windsor Redevelopment Agency purchased it, almost 5 acres, for about $1.1 million. They used $700,000 of their own funds and $450,000 from the Sonoma County Agricultural Preservation Open Space District. Interesting. They probably pushed the envelope on that, but they got it. And they then spent $2.9 billion to build a park, and this is what it looks like today. So they used the money to widen sidewalks, bury utilities, and improve the surrounding streets. The goal was to attract a private developer willing to gamble on a unique new urbanist town center. It wasn't easy to do. This is the far suburbs, and most of the developers there were very skeptical of new urbanism. And they finally negotiated it. They gave him higher density. They let his restaurants encroach on the sidewalk with their tables, little urbanism, and they reduced the parking requirements. So urbanism way out in Windsor. And Town Green with a stage, covered pavilions, a playground, a plum tree orchard, a fountain reflecting pools, a historical timeline walk. There actually is a historic oak grove next door, and they put in Wi-Fi and a lot of programming, free and popular programming with concerts, movie theaters, and a farmer's market. A great space, a great urban space. New way of thinking for people out there. Okay, number 3, totally different. Again, all these are different. Mission Creek Sports Course in San Francisco. So many of you may have heard of Mission Bay. It's the colossus of infill projects in the Bay Area. 303 acres of former industry, port rail terminal, and warehousing. So you're looking in the distance there is downtown. To the right is the Bay Bridge heading over to Oakland. If the Golden Gate Bridge was on the picture, it would be way off to the left. And this is Mission Bay, which is on the bay and used to be a heavy industrial area. After decades of decline, the San Francisco Board of Supervisors voted in 1998 to redevelop it into 6,000 residential units, 6 million square feet of commercial space, a hotel, a university campus, retail, and 49 acres of new parkland. And the first of these new parks to come online is 3-acre Mission Creek Sports Courts, a facility designed to activate land and water space that is partially under a freeway. The story is complex and pretty fascinating. So we're going to go to blackout so I can tell this story. I don't have all the pictures to accompany it, but it's a great story. By the 1990s, most of the land in Mission Bay was owned either by the city or by the real estate company that grew out of the Southern Pacific Railroad, which at one time was the largest landowner in the state of California. Under normal circumstances, since the area was basically uninhabited, the company would have had a pretty free hand to develop the site more or less the way it wished, which would have probably meant a pretty modest amount of parkland. However, there was a small, historic, outspoken community living in houses that were literally floating on Mission Creek. Can I back up? Yeah. So Mission Creek is that little line of greenish towards the upper left part of the yellow outlined area. That's Mission Creek. It has these old houses that were built in the creek, sort of floating on the creek. Years earlier, there had been an idea for a sterile collection of concrete water channels and high-rise towers, and the homeowners had killed that concept. Now they demanded parks, and this time the developer listened. And the reason the developer was listening was that he was dependent on getting special financing from the San Francisco Redevelopment Agency to fund the public part of his infrastructure needs. So the city and the agency and this vocal community therefore had considerable leverage to require that land be dedicated to public parks and to affordable housing and other benefits. Without the public financial help, the entire project would not have been feasible, so there was a lot of leverage. Ultimately, the redevelopment agency and the master developer agreed to an amazing compromise. For every net acre of physical development, net acre being the actual buildings without the roads. For every net acre of physical development, they pledged 0.45, almost half an acre of parkland. It's amazing for San Francisco. In addition, since people had been burned by these kinds of agreements in the past, that the parks kept never actually being built, even though they were promised, the agreement stipulated that the parkland had to be brought online at the same rate as the development of buildings. So they couldn't hold back the park development while waiting for the residents to move in. So park funding in Mission Bay comes from two sources: tax increment financing and a community facilities district, which is an area with a special property tax on real estate in addition to the normal property tax. The community facilities district runs until the year 2043, at which point it'll expire. And the tax increment financing probably also, I'm not sure the year for that, maybe the same year. If it weren't for those two, it wouldn't be possible for Mission Bay to create any new parks. And ironically, if Mission Creek had contained a large number of small landowners, it probably never would have created all these parks, because in order to get a community facilities district, it has to be a vote of all the property owners, and when you have a lot of small owners, it's less likely that they'll all vote in favor of that. Here, the Southern Pacific company wanted this thing to happen, and they had all the votes, so they said, we're going to do it. So today, the park contains just an amazing array of, it's beautifully designed. Whenever I get this show fully up and running, we'll have some great pictures. But basketball, volleyball, tennis, a dog park, a boat launch for kayaks and canoes, a walkway, a bikeway, a multi-purpose lawn. It has a special fund for maintenance and operations. And we calculated that the annual fee per housing unit in the development comes to about $150 to $200 per unit. So it's not inexpensive, but it's less than a gym. So if the San Francisco story is straight-laced and corporate, the one across the bay in Oakland is unscripted and almost bohemian. It's the story of the Friends of the Rock Ridge Greenway. Friends of the Rock Ridge Greenway. So they call themselves FROG. And Rock Ridge is a neighborhood in Oakland. So you can see where San Francisco is. Oakland is right across the bay, that sort of big goldish, yellowish area. And Rock Ridge is maybe a third of the way up the hills in Oakland. The first effort by, we're going black for a couple of minutes. The first effort by frog activists to create a park failed. And this is sometimes an emblematic situation that the first effort fails and strengthens people's desire to succeed. What had happened was the Department of Motor Vehicles licensing facility was being renovated, and a bunch of park activists said, well, since they're renovating this thing, let's convert half of the old parking lot into a park to mitigate for this new facility. Great idea. The other half of the neighborhood protested, we're going to lose all of our parking spaces if you do that. So like I said, this is a classic case of parks versus parking. And the parkers, the car parkers won, and the frog proposal was rejected. But it got the group looking for other places to create a park. And they eventually realized, they quickly realized that they actually had a chunk of underutilized park open space right in their very midst that could be upgraded into a park. And this is the kind of thing that happens in dense neighborhoods. You take an unappealing site in an undense neighborhood and nobody pays any attention to it, and it just sits there for a long time. But in a crowded neighborhood, people give second thought to areas that they wouldn't otherwise think about. And this one was pretty unappealing. It had a semi-abandoned basketball court and kind of a de facto dog park, and it had fenced-off land owned by the flood control district, and it was long and narrow, and it had a big highway overhead. But it also had a creek, And the wall under the highway had already been painted with a really cool 120-foot long mural back in the 70s. And the whole park ideas really started gaining traction when 2 frog volunteers came up with a master plan that would build playgrounds on either sides of this linear park, one for toddlers and one for older kids. So the frog volunteers dove into this. Oakland doesn't have a like a super coherent park creation system, but it has very motivated volunteers, and they dove in and they went and they got permission from the California Department of Transportation to improve the site, and then they got permission from Alameda County Flood Control that it would be okay as long as they didn't block access to what the drains that they needed to service. And by early 2000, they had their sites so they could begin fundraising. And the fundraising is fabulous. It's a fabulous story. They worked with the vice mayor of the city, and so they got qualified to legally receive funding from city bond measures as if they were an agency. And so Oakland's Measure DD, which is called the Trust for Clean Water and Safe Parks, had money available, and they got $140,000 from that. And then California had something called Proposition 12, which is called the Safe Neighborhood Parks, Clean Water, Clean Air, and Coastal Protection Bond Act. And they got $493,000 from that. And then they got $60,000 for a tot lot under something called the Oakland General Obligation Bonds for Parks. And then they did something I've never heard of. They found out that some of the bond money in the city, I think it was, maybe the state, but the city bond money had been sitting in the bank so long that it actually had $400,000 of interest on the unspent money. And so they applied and got that leftover interest money, $400,000 for their park. And after that, the vice mayor, who loved them from the start, was so impressed that she gave her entire $125,000 annual discretionary allotment to the park as a challenge grant, which enabled them to start doing private fundraising. So they did a mail campaign, and they did monthly articles in all the local newspapers, and they solicited businesses, and they had a reception and a silent auction, and they generated over $200,000 in cash and about $150,000 in volunteer labor, or in volunteer equipment. So the park was built in 3 phases. Phase 1 was 2 playgrounds, the restoration of the mural, and improve access to the creek. Phase 2 was paths, basketball hoops, swings, a water fountain, and public art. And their public art is they put in a group of small telescopes that are aimed at brass castings of animals that were inhabiting the landscape surrounding the park. And then phase 3 was a solar-powered restroom. So total costs for phases 1 and 2 came to only $2.9 million, partly because Frog mobilized the entire community to help. They got 1,300 volunteers, and here you see some of them. They showed up for 10 consecutive days to actually build the playground under the direction of a firm from New York State. And while 3/4 of them were building the playground, others were preparing 3 meals a day for the volunteer workers and providing free child care for their children. So it was a community build extravaganza, wonderful extravaganza. And Frog now works to sustain community involvement, which remains the backbone of the park. So you can see all the things in the park, and all maintenance other than grass cutting and trash removal, which the city does, is done by neighbors in big work days. So that's pretty much it. 4 communities, 4 parks, 4 different stories, 4 wonderful stories. Each one could hardly be more different, except that each one was intensely desired and fought for by advocates and assisted by planners, which leads me to my concluding message. Planning plus advocacy equals success. No planning, no park, but no advocacy, no park. So I know most of you are planners, and some of you may have some wonderful successes. Some of you may have great frustrations. But in our experience, it's got to be two hands clapping between the advocates and the park planners, and that's where we see the successful creation of these infill parks. That's who I am and my contact info. We're actually moving our office next week, so we have the new address on there. Of course, most people don't use addresses anymore, but that's my email and my telephone number. So maybe we can throw it open. Mia, thank you very much for having me for either text questions or verbal questions and comments, observations.
Yes, so just as a reminder, if you'd like to ask a question, please do so by either typing it into the question box or selecting the raise your hand button that looks like a little hand. Give people a few minutes. So we have our first question, which is, what are the best locations or environments for successful parks?
That's a very, very big question. We think of parks very, very broadly, as hopefully everybody on this call does, everything from sports parks to walking parks to rail trails to community gardens to dog parks, the fastest growing subset of parks in the country, in urban areas in the country, on and on and on and on. So I don't think there's an easy answer to the question. The best, the most fortunate cities are the ones that were planned properly from the beginning. I live in Washington, D.C., where we wake up every morning and thank the stars that L'Enfant planned a city with parks and squares and circles and things like that don't have to be recreated out of helter-skelter development over the centuries. But even in a situation like that, you can recreate parks mostly in conjunction with development. If there's room for a single new parking lot in your city, there's room for a new park. So this whole concept of, well, our city is all built out, there's no room for parks, is not true. It just takes a lot of thinking, planning, and advocacy.
Great, thank you. We've had a couple more questions come in. The first one is, was a detailed needs assessment or study done for each park developed? And if so, are those available online somewhere?
Well, the Mission Bay was very tightly scripted and orchestrated, and I'm sure there's very strong documentation for all of that. And Windsor and the Emeryville one probably as well. The Frog Park, as you saw, was much more catch as catch can, and I know there was some planning done on that, but probably more on the fly in a way. I don't have all the details, but if you send me an email, I can make some connections. One of the unfortunate things that happened in San Francisco was that halfway through this process, the San Francisco Redevelopment Authority, along with every other redevelopment authority in California, was abolished. So there was a lot of scrambling for how to make up for this super important process. Mission Bay was so far advanced that this whole process was passed on to other agencies, and I'll need to get you the contact info. But send me an email, and we'll try and link you with that. Or maybe we can link NARC with some of that.
Absolutely. So our next question is, an early slide showed parks ranked second or third on the list of infrastructure needs. How was that survey conducted, and who responded?
That survey was done by the Association of Bay Area Governments. I don't know if they do it on a regular basis or not. It was a very detailed, very thorough, very outstanding survey of a tremendous number of infrastructure needs along a wide range of issues that regional planners care about. It was sent to every jurisdiction of which, or every priority development area, of which there were 93. They got 68 responses back, and this is the universe that they analyzed. So ABAG has that, and either you can find them or I can help you find them.
Great. Our next question is, what are the first steps a community can take to develop a comprehensive plan for park planning?
Well, I mean, we work, basically we're working with larger communities, so I hope this holds for everyone on the phone. But basically, number one is your parks department. Some of you have terrific parks departments. Some of you may have struggling parks departments, and in some cases, people have attempted to figure out alternative ways of creating parks not using their parks departments, and some great parks have been created outside of the normal rubric of parks departments. But we always say start with the parks department and start with the park master plan, which hopefully there's a park master plan every 10 years or so, not much more than every 10 years. Some people do it every 5 or 7 years. And so that parks master plan is where you assemble all of your data about what you have, what you don't have, what you need, what you want, what trends are coming, what trends are going downhill, and all the other things that are going on in your town. Some towns are steady state, but most aren't. Most are either growing in population, some are growing in physical land area, some are shrinking. So in every case, there are park changes that probably need to be made. If for some reason you don't have a parks department or your parks department doesn't have any money to do this, you need to find an alternative way of doing it. In some cases, you might be lucky enough to have a large, wealthy, motivated foundation that will pay for a master planning process and do all this as a gift to the city. Or you're going to have to work with advocates to get funding through your city council to do a good job on this.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. You can pause for 1 second to see if there are any other questions. As a reminder, you can submit them either in the question box or by clicking the little hand icon. Okay. Well, seems like we have no more questions.
Okay.
So before I say thank you, I would like to give a quick plug for the Green Infrastructure and Forestry Toolkit website that NARC is putting out in partnership with Virginia Tech University. This is going to be a comprehensive website that will guide both the novice and the expert planner through incorporating green infrastructure and urban forestry into their plans, implementation, management. It's going to have case studies, tools, a whole host of resources, and it will be launching in May of this year. So be on the lookout for that. You can see it at gifttoolkit.org. So with that, I will say thank you very much, Peter. This has been very informational. We will be sending out the slides and a recording to everyone who registered, and it will also be available on our website. And with that, I think we can conclude.
Okay, thank you for having me.